Do I have an original thought in my head? My bald head? Maybe if I were happier, my hair wouldn't be falling out. Life is short. I need to make the most of it. Today's the first day of the rest of my life. I'm a walking cliche. I really need to go to the doctor, have my leg checked. There's something wrong. A bump. The dentist called again. I'm way overdue. If I stopped putting things off, I would be happier. All I do is sit on my fat ass. If my ass wasn't fat, I would be happier. I wouldn't have to wear these shirts with the tails out all the time. Like that's fooling anyone. Fat ass. I should start jogging again. 5 miles a day. Really do it this time. Maybe rock climbing. I need to turn my life around. What do I need to do? I need to fall in love. I need to have a girlfriend. I need to read more, improve myself. What if I learned Russian or something? Or took up an instrument? I could speak Chinese. I'd be the screenwriter who speaks Chinese and plays the oboe. That would be cool. I should get my hair cut short. Stop trying to fool myself and everyone else and think I have a full head of hair. How pathetic is that? Just be real, confident. Isn't that what women are attracted to? Men don't have to be attractive. But that's not true, especially these days. Almost as much pressure on men as there is on women these days. Why should I be made to feel I have to apologize for my existence? Maybe it's my brain chemistry. Maybe that's what's wrong with me. Bad chemistry. All my problems and anxiety can be reduced to a chemical imbalance or some kind of misfiring synapses. I need to get help for that. But I'll still be ugly, though. Nothing's gonna change that.
Merry Matrix, my beloved true seekers. Yes, that is how I usually greet people during what has become known as the holiday season. This time of year when Jehovah truly injects his spiritual morphine into the consciousness of Western society and then commands his powers and principalities to feed off our soul ambergris until we are grinning idiot Stepford citizens by the end of the year. He hides the reason for the season, which is the continual death and rebirth of the Savior God-man, the solar logos, if you will, and puts on his Captain Obvious hat by telling us to be nicer, kinder, more hopeful and compassionate. Yet at the same time the demiurge, or also known in his dual identity of the walrus and the carpenter, is slowly pulling the rug off from underneath our feet by hardening our hearts with materialism, family dysfunction, unattainable moral expectation, disappointing Christmas bonuses, and those excruciating Christmas pageants where we can boast our newest digital cameras while hearing poor children sing out of tune.
It's great, isn't it? People buying stuff, lugging bags around, maxing out their credit cards. It's like everyone in the whole world has joined together to embrace financial ruin.
And let's not even talk about how Yaldabaoth presses his celestial dark martins on the faces of those who are truly lonely and destitute against the cold tarmac of an Epicurean society until their eyes pop out just before they get a brief and last glimpse of seeing a life of fulfillment and fellowship. Like the Gospel of Philip says, God is a man-eater.
Jesus, why does God hate me? Huh?
Not my time of the year, my beloved true seekers. And usually when I swing my holy hammer hard against the black iron prison. I may cause a few cracks and chips there, but perhaps some may escape the saccharine Alcatraz, where your greatest highlight is sleeping with a coworker during an office party, or getting a present that somehow defines how much you are loved by others.
My God, not everything's about you and your little job and your little world.
And speaking of presents, don't forget to give lots of presents to your offspring and in-laws, or else they'll make baby Orthodox Jesus cry and then want more money during collections. So Merry Matrix, this is Aeon Byte, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.cam. On this approximately December 20th, the year of our Demiurge 2008.
Viewer discretion is advised.
My name is Scrooge Abraxas, giving an early happy birthday to Mithras, Horus, Attis, Dionysus, Tammuz, and the other sun gods who were born on December 25th. And like I said, this program lowers the boom on orthodoxy, perhaps on the day you've just finished fighting lines at the local replicant mall to buy stuff you'll be paying for until the equinox.
Things you own end up owning you.
Today, or more like in this eternal now, we have the pleasure of speaking to Hector Avalos, author of The End of Biblical Studies, Fighting Words, The Origins of Religious Violence, Can One Know God if God Exists? And Professor of Biblical and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Iowa. Our theme orbits around the first book we mentioned, The End of Biblical Studies. And why not? I think it may be time for this funeral for a decrepit friend, even beyond the sapient and judicious interview with the good professor.
Yea, believe in me and ye shall find peace.
Yeah, we've heard that crap for about 2,000 years now. We want to hear something new.
In my mortal incarnation, I'm more into the 19th century liberal Protestant and Dutch radical scholars that really played doctor with the Bible's childlike nubile body and, at the same time, began to truly pay serious and fair attention to the Gnostics and the Marcionites. In my tinsel opinion, biblical scholarship has deteriorated since then. All the virgin theological cherries were popped. St. Paul was rescued from the clutches of orthodoxy and espied as a Hellenistic yogi. God was suddenly recognized for the Union leader thug that he was. Wonderful ideas like Q and the documentary hypothesis came about, and various other real presents were discovered under the tree of truth-seeking.
Just awe-inspiring stuff.
And then not much else, with some exceptions, of course. But buttery reality is that biblical scholarship has hit a wall, part of this wall built by both conservative and liberal scholars themselves. Theologians became trapped on one side of the wall. True breakthroughs by the ecumenical spirit on the other side. And they either just played it safe by tweaking old ideas or mumbling new, watered-down ones.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
Some tried to scale the wall by becoming radical thinkers, which is not so bad, I guess. Suddenly Jesus became an Obama-like community activist, a military revolutionist, a wandering stoic, a historical Essene or Pharisee, a magician, a candy cane hippie, a gay activist, a space alien, and all sort of avatars that would make the Hindu godhead happy. Or more like jealous. And I won't even get into other curious notions like liberation theology, feminist theology, American evangelical theology, revisionist theology, black theology, and other rather queer proposals. Basically, Jesus has become a projection of the more ambitious angels of our imagination, while around him archaeology, history, and textual criticism disintegrates his theater stage and truth of the churches built in his name.
He's not the Messiah! He's a very naughty boy!
There's no real evidence in any field you venture into if you're looking for mind-expanding flowers in anymore. Scholars, even evangelical ones, are just beginning to publicly admit they're facing the grim reality they're working on copies of endless copies. And that's a big problem.
Scholars maintain that the translation was lost hundreds of years ago.
Corniest facts prove history and Jesus, and most of the Bible, are just oceans of rationality apart. In other words, we have reached maximum altitude. The masks are dropping from the compartments of logic and faith, and we can see the curvature of the world of fiction and mythology. right where the Gnostics started, and right where we have returned in our revival.
What is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
Professor Avalos, The End of Biblical Studies, is very close in ambience to Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus, although it's a little heavier in ideas, has a wider latitude in theories, and is probably better written. After all, Bart Ehrman's real opus is his book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, where he really pawns fundamentalism, while standing more on the side of the Gnostics and the other exterminated Christianities. Too bad he then decided to dilute his ideas to make more money with what became the best-selling Misquoting Jesus. But Ehrman certainly opened a psychological Pandora's box mainstream Christianity is still having trouble closing.
The power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you!
Either way, The End of Biblical Studies is a worthwhile read, with refreshing observations and arguments from all corners of the free-thinking winds, from archaeology to sociology, from death psychology to post-enlightenment morality, from comparative history to theological Chinese finger traps.
Trust the gods, Leonardo.
I'd prefer you trusted your reason.
And what about the Gnostics? What about our propaganda? What about it, you literalist bullies? Reality, like sanity, is fluid in our hands. History is important, but it can be bent without breaking if it takes us into the realms of disencumbering allegory, Sol Rosetta Stone symbolism, and, as always, mythology, the secret inner language of the spirit.
We fight for men and women whose poetry is not yet written, but which will presently be as enviable and as renowned as any.
We like reinterpreting, reinventing, and retweaking religious denominons if there is a chance it will lead us to a higher state of being. Irenaeus of Lyons, back in the 2nd century, bitched like a tween that we continually pumped out new gospels every day and gave cryptic meanings to the Orthodox gospels. In other words, and as an example, almost 2,000 years ago, I might have seen a vision or heard some oral story about a great sage or tragic hero. I would have written my own elucidation, signed it, I don't know, the Gospel according to Belial's ass, walked out of church after inspecting the Apostle Paul's stigmata and deckless Sunday dress, handed it to my nearest Gnostic friend, and said, "Dude, read it, let me know what you think, and then rewrite it any way you want. I don't care. I've got the answers that have brought me closer to my real self. Endless scenarios to speculate when I write another gospel tomorrow, and eternal possibilities to experience and create in dream or in another vision."
Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
Yes, my beloved truth seekers, there is no end to Gnostic studies because, by definition, it is endless self-discovery, endless scenarios, and endless possibilities to experience and to create. You see, our Jesus is timeless, without boundaries, and too big to be just relegated to the static pages of a two-dimensional book.
The Bible is basic instructions before leaving Earth. TM. Put that shit on a t-shirt.
Like St. Paul says in that lustrous passage in Galatians 2, "For through the law I died to the law, that I might live unto God. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." Okay, and even beyond my drivel, the Gnostics have the upper hand. The Nag Hammadi library has barely, and I mean barely, been deciphered, no matter how many books or my crappy shows come out a year. and you really can't decipher it because, by definition, his extrovert and introvert message is revelatory quicksand, even for the most secular of scholars. Furthermore, the arenas beyond Gnosticism proper are also just beginning to flower, no matter how much New Age and literalists try to melt it like the guy hit by the acid barrels in the movie RoboCop.
I'll buy that for $1.
There's the Kabbalah, Hermeticism, the Cathars, the Bogomils, Manichaeanism, and other branches we've barely begun to unriddle. There is a lot of apocrypha that was cast aside like a small penis man. There are the surviving Mandeans and Yazidi in Iraq we are just now shaking our theological hands with. There are the secrets of the Sufis and the Ismailis, who remain hiding from the solar fury of Allah and his extroverted Muslim denominations. Slowly, the esoteric and the pagan world is understanding the Himalayan afflatus of St. Paul, the myth-maker as Hayam Makam called him. Movies by Philip K. Dick keep shaking the psychological spine of Western thought. C.G. Jung's ideas get stronger with each generation. Esoteric Christianity from the Eastern faiths is finally seeing the light of day, and you know Sophia is a studette among many of them. And there are so many other examples, my beloved truth seekers. And, the Orthodox have got the King James Bible and Benny Hinn.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.
Alright, let me put it back in my pants. I've had my Jehovah cosmic ego moment, and thank you for indulging me. The reality is that Orthodoxy still has the muscle and attention of the civilized world. Orthodoxy won, has kept winning, and continues to write history even though we're not even in the fourth quarter of the game.
Mister, you may conquer the air, but the birds will lose their wonder, and the clouds will smell of gasoline.
Gnosticism is still the minority of all minority faiths, but there is no strength in numbers, have no such misconception. They were scared of Marcion and us in the beginning. They're scared of us now because they know that one quasar idea can disrupt the matrix enough so the curious can escape. Throw a flare into Plato's cave so a few can see. Halt the cogs of the dark city so that some may reach the ocean. Use a fire extinguisher on the fiery sword of the cherub guarding the tree of life. Or even rescue Ellen from her tower in the city of Troy that has always just represented our ego. But enough of my drivel. Let's sour the season with our interview with Professor Hector Avalos, centering on his masterful work, The End of Biblical Studies. Merry Matrix.
The ACLU's got to take a lot of blame for this.
Oh, yeah.
And I know I'll hear from them for this, but throwing God, or successfully with the help of the federal court system, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools. The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this because God will not be mocked, and when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
Well, I totally concur.
This is the Aeon Byte interview. With us today, we have the pleasure of having Professor Hector Avalos discussing his book, The End of Biblical Studies. How are you doing today, Dr. Avalos?
I'm doing very well. It's good to be with you.
No, thank you very much for joining the show. The first question might be perhaps the most interesting question. You begin your book with one powerful sentence that is the crux of your thesis, and that is, quote, the only mission of biblical studies should be to end biblical studies as we know it.
That's right.
Yeah, briefly, why would you say that, and why would you write a book that could be easily entitled, "Please destroy my profession so I have no livelihood," or "Please fire me"?
Well, the key to it is the phrase, "as we know it." As we know it today, biblical studies consist of a very religionist orientation. It is there to prop up the Bible and the religion that represents the Bible. Christianity, Judaism, in particular, are the religions today that depend on the Bible. But so ending biblical studies means ending it as it is currently practiced. Most people don't realize that the title of my book is a double entendre. It is the end of biblical studies in the sense of termination of biblical studies, but also the word end in the sense of the purpose of biblical studies. So it has a double meaning. Another way to look at the end of biblical studies as much like a doctor who, in working to eradicate illness, is working to end his own employment. So to me, bibliolatry is sort of like a human pathology. In working to end the privileging of the Bible in the world, it is not unlike a physician who, in trying to end illness or suffering, will put it into his profession.
Dr. Avalos, what exactly did you mean by the term bibliolatry that you use often in your book?
Yeah, bibliolatry refers to the idea that the Bible has a privileged position in the world, that it should be, if not worshipped, nearly worshipped. And in biblical studies, of course, it is thought that the Bible is so important. It's the most beautiful, the most powerful, the most ethical book ever that was written. So that whole idea that the Bible somehow is a special book, and not to say that it hasn't had an influence, but that it should have an influence, is what I mean by bibliolatry. And so it has, of course, gradations. Some people would say, yes, it's an important book. Others would say, I live my whole life by the Bible. But in general, the idea that the Bible is a special book, a superior book, ethically, aesthetically, historically, scientifically, that's what I mean by bibliolatry.
And you started your life more on the side of the conservative movement, didn't you? And slowly evolved into more of a humanist.
I started my life in Mexico as a Protestant evangelical Pentecostal, and I became a child evangelist by the age of 7. I was not just a conservative, I was a fundamentalist, as most people would call them. I believe the world was created in 6 days, that Jesus resurrected from the dead, that almost everything reported in the Bible was historically accurate, whenever it wasn't figurative. I was as fundamentalist as a fundamentalist can be today. And after studying the Bible, and I always say it's the Bible that made an unbeliever out of me, it's reading it and realizing that what I had been told about the Bible did not coincide with what I was learning from other sources. And it wasn't an immediate transformation, but mostly during my high school years, I began to study the Bible in quite a bit of depth and learn the original languages so that I could check for myself whether any information that I was being provided was accurate or not. And in the process, I came to realize that all of the arguments that were made for the divine origin and historicity of the Bible were really not that good. In fact, they were an illusion many times. And finally, I had to realize that I did not believe that the Bible was of divine origin, and that I did not believe in any sort of supernatural entity. And so I became what you would call an atheist. But I did not leave the study of the Bible. I really wanted to know how it originated historically, who put it together, why, and why it had so much influence on the world. So it turned to historical questions. And now in the last 10 years or so, I've seen the sort of harm that reliance on the Bible has caused. And I have come to the conclusion that we really should end the privileging of the Bible. Not to say that we should burn or ban the Bible, it's just that we should not accord it any more privilege than any other book from antiquity. It is no better ethically or morally or historically or scientifically than any other book that we could just as well privilege today.
You mean like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Odyssey or something like that? It should be put right next to the shelf next to it.
That's right. So it's not a case of forcing people to not read their Bibles or burning Bibles. That's not the case at all. What I mean to end is the privileging of this book. And it's used as an authority in modern society.
One of the arguments you use on why the Bible is pretty much or has become culturally useless in our modern times is the fact that most people really have no idea what's in the Bible itself, right?
That's right. Most people the Bible sells very well. It's the best-selling book of all time. But the fact is people don't read the Bibles being sold. You have various surveys showing consistently over the last few decades that most people don't read the Bible. Some 20% or more of Protestants never read it. Some 33% of Catholics never read it, according to the Baylor survey. So even those that do read it actually are reading a very small portion of it, or at least applying a very small portion of it. It's like going to McDonald's and eating the sesame seed off a Big Mac and then throwing away the rest of the Big Mac. And that's the way the Bible has been used. And not to say that it doesn't have influence, because the few passages that are used can have a lot of impact. But if you were to ask people, average people on the street, some of them couldn't name the first book. They could tell you how many books are in the Bible. They haven't even read much of it at all. It is one of those paradoxes where people own Bibles that they don't read.
Why do scholars work so very hard at making the Bible a timeless work of morality in our modern days, when in reality, as you point out, it is more often used as an excuse for violence, sexism, and racism? Why are they so blind to this?
You have to look at the sociology of biblical scholars. Most biblical scholars are committed members of faith communities of some sort. So, about 80-90% of biblical scholars are Christian or Jewish, and very few are agnostic or atheist. And those that are openly atheist are, just a handful that you can name. So, first and foremost, it's the way that these scholars are raised. They're raised in the faith tradition that they then study. Most people actually end up studying something that's very personal to them, whether that's psychology or whether that's religious studies or engineering. There's something personal about what they study. And so biblical scholars are mostly religious people. And secondly, there is a bit of self-interest insofar as their employment depends on convincing the world that the Bible matters. If they could not convince the world that the Bible matters, then they would not have a profession. And so I'm actually the altruistic scholar. I am saying I am willing to give up my profession as long as we can work as biblical scholars to convince the world and to tell them the true origins of this Bible. Most readers, for example, are not told that there's no such thing as the Bible. The Bible is a construct of modern scholars for the most part. People are not told, for example, that what they call the New Testament, the text has been reconstructed by scholars, and so that reconstructed text is not identical to any single manuscript of the New Testament in the ancient world. It is a complete reconstruction by scholars. There is a myth that these reconstructions get us closer to the time of Jesus, and they don't. Basically, the best we can do is get it down to the 2nd century at best. And so, even so, people will differ on what the text should be. So, when they sell the Bible, they don't tell you that really it is something manufactured by scholarship, ancient or modern. And if people knew that, they probably wouldn't buy them. So to me, it's a bit of dishonesty in advertising when people are sold Bibles, because they're buying them under the supposition that they're getting some sort of access to the most original text or to God's Word, depending on their viewpoint.
And isn't it true, Dr. Avalos, that the end of biblical studies might actually help religion instead of hurt it so much?
Well, it depends on what you mean by helping or hurting religion. There are some people that say, we don't need sacred text to have a religion, and so it might help those religions that don't depend on text, that they believe, for example, they might believe in direct revelation from the supernatural, or a more democratic type of religion where there's no one text that is privileged above others. If that's what you mean, well, yes, it might help religion in that sense, or certain types of religion. But it could also help Christianity if you mean by Christianity that you depend solely on oral tradition. And there were some early Christians who actually didn't trust text. They would argue that oral tradition was actually a better witness to Jesus than textual witnesses. And so, but by and large, most Christians today are very text-bound, and it would not help text-bound forms of Christianity for sure.
And I'm sure you'd agree with me that the phenomenon of biblical inerrancy has really done damage to Christianity as a whole.
Well, yet, because so many of the things that inerrantists point to as being historical or scientific have been in mind by modern science and historical and archaeological research. So every time inerrantists say this has ironclad proof, or we find something else that undermines it. And so that's why most biblical scholars are not inerrantists today. But they still would have the idea that the Bible is more valuable than other books, or has some general historical truth or divine truth. And so the idea persists in weaker form. Now, I also believe that the term fundamentalist is sort of misused insofar as usually it's a liberal word. Liberals like to classify those that take the Bible literally as fundamentalists. But the truth is, all Christians that I know are fundamentalists on something. It just depends on which text they take literally. For example, today fundamentalists are seen as those Christians that take Genesis 1 literally. But you don't apply the word to those that take some other passages literally, like, for example, that Jesus is the Son of God, or that Jesus preaches love. They take those passages literally. Well, they're fundamentalist about that. I say every Christian probably is a fundamentalist, but it depends on which text you're talking about.
Professor Avalos, yeah, one thing I liked that you pointed out is in Genesis 1, God created the earth and the heavens, but most people miss that the waters were already there.
Yes.
So that kind of goes back to the old Hellenistic Eastern view that there was always something there. There was always chaos.
Yeah,
Yahweh just formed something out of something.
Yeah, that was already there, right. It conforms to the view that we find in the ancient Near East and the Enuma Elish. The world also begins with water. In Greek thought, Thales also thought the world began with water. And so mostly the creationists misread Genesis. They also don't realize that in Genesis 1, the sky is a solid object, probably made out of metal, which of course is not what we find from scientific observation. The sky is not a solid object.
What is an example or two on how Bible translators play fast and loose with translations to keep the Bible culturally relevant? It seems your book, The End of Biblical Study, stresses the hiding of polytheism as one of the most important keynotes.
Yes. I say that most readers of the Bible pursue reading the Bible under the assumption that biblical translators are there to help them discover what the Bible says. And my thesis is that often biblical translators are there to hide what the Bible says. Because if you knew what it said, you might not like it as much. So, yes, the polytheism in Genesis 1 is one example. There's polytheism all over the place. You have the example of Proverbs 8, where apparently a female deity is working with God in creating the world. There's not so much hiding as people interpret that as poetic, when it probably is not. Another one would be the way that Jesus is portrayed in the Good News Bible. The Good News Bible is probably the most egregious example of how passages are sugar-coated for modern audiences who may not like what Jesus has to say. In Luke 14:26, Jesus commands that if you are going to be his follower, you have to hate your father and mother. And the Good News Bible substitutes love. You must love me more than your father and mother. So they erase the word hate, which is in Greek in there, miphel, and they substitute a word that is not there. And so that is a way to hide what Jesus actually said, at least according to that passage.
Yeah, and for the listener, there are plenty more examples than he that he gives us. Yeah, we could go all day on this, but definitely check out the book. And Dr. Avalos, what are some of the major problems of textual criticism, and including and besides the fact that it can never truly reconstruct the Bible properly, or is that the only Achilles heel we have that matters?
Well, that is certainly the major one, because textual critics began by advertising themselves as those who could reconstruct the most original text, if not the original text. And for hundreds of years, people believe, that we had the most original text possible. Now it looks like we not only don't we have the original text, but you cannot have the original text, because even if you found, let's say, the manuscript behind all the manuscripts that currently exist, we wouldn't know whether that itself was a copy of an earlier one. So unless you saw the very first copy being made, you don't know what has been copied or not. And the problem continues to be that the earliest text of the New Testament we have is a very small fragment called P52 from the 2nd century. And there's no way that we can get from the 2nd century down to the year 30, around the time when Jesus lived. A further problem, of course, is that Jesus is thought to have spoken Aramaic. And everything we have is in Greek, except for a smattering here and there of Aramaic. Even if you could reconstruct the Greek text perfectly, it still would not be the original of what Jesus said, because That's still a translation of what Jesus said. So but most people don't realize that.
And how has biblical archaeology failed to buttress biblical studies?
The best way to visualize this is to go and look at a list of things the biblical archaeologists thought had good evidence for them, say in the year 1900. So in the year 1900, a lot of biblical scholars would still say that maybe there was a Noah's flood, that Abraham and Isaac really existed, Joseph existed, Moses existed, and so forth. You look at the year 2008, and you look at the work of someone like William G. Deaver, who is famous for complaining against the extreme skeptics of the Bible. And even he would say that most of the first 5 books of the Bible are not historical. In fact, when you look at his list of what he thinks is historical, it boils down to a few books out of the entire set of what Protestants call the Old Testament, 39 books. Even some of the people that are the flag bearers for some of the traditional, more traditional end of critical studies would say most of what you find in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus is not historically confirmable or confirmed. And the reason, of course, is because archaeology has made great strides in the last 150 years. Some of the sites, for example, that were supposed to be destroyed in the conquest of Israel under Joshua could be shown that not to be there at the time that they were said to be destroyed. The Exodus, which would have involved over 1 million people if you read the Bible literally, appears to have left no trace and anywhere between Egypt and Israel. Solomon, who is supposed to have had a kingdom that stretched from Egypt to what is now Iraq, is attested nowhere outside of the Bible. You know, no one is sending letters to him. No one's receiving letters from him. And that's not the case with most of the bigger empires in the ancient world. You know, it's like having an America and then no trace of America outside of America. So that'd be very odd. So in general, it's because archaeologists have now dug enough to see and disprove a lot of things in the Bible. One of the things that I think is definitely disproven by archaeology is Noah's flood. You know, if there were a Noah's flood, you would have a single archaeological layer of destruction interrupting human habitation around the world. So you should see that layer in Mexico. You should see that layer in China. You should see that layer in Mesopotamia. There is no such layer, you know. There is no such layer at all. And so that is definite proof that no such event took place that interrupted human habitation at the same time around the world.
Dr. Avalos, why is it so hard, as you mentioned in your book, to even make progress in the last 2 centuries in further understanding the historical Jesus, even from a liberal standpoint like the Jesus Seminar has done?
Yeah. Well, you cannot bridge the gap that is there between the documents we have and the time of Jesus. Again, the earliest documents for Jesus that we have, P52, and it doesn't even have Jesus in itself, but we think it's there. But the earliest New Testament document we have is P52 from the 2nd century. So we have no idea what has been added or subtracted between the year 30 and the 2nd century. Now, when you look at the other Gospels, that one is a little piece of the Gospel of John. When you look at the other Gospels, they come from 3rd and 4th centuries, you know, the most complete things we have. Again, we would have no idea how to reconstruct that gap. Now, a lot of people say, well, what about Josephus and some of these Roman authors? The problem with those authors is that the manuscripts of those works come from the medieval period. And so we have no idea what was added or subtracted, you know, over 1,000 years. So it's even a worse problem for us. So Josephus doesn't really help us, except where we can confirm is true or not independently. And those are very few things that we can confirm independently. So it's sort of like having a murderer, and but the only testimony you have is from 100 years later. No one can verify the testimony. No one can cross-examine the witnesses and so forth. So unless we have independent evidence that comes forth from the time of Jesus, you're still going to have this problem. And nothing has come forth except very disputed things like the James ossuary, which is now on trial in Israel, and things like that. We really don't have any data since the earliest manuscript found, which that 52 found. So, from the time of Jesus anyway, none tree at all. So without data, there's no history.
On this show, we've debunked the infamous Jesus versus Julius Caesar argument. One of the newer ones, or maybe I just missed it, that Christian apologetics love to use is the Jesus versus King Arthur argument. Tell us why these historical comparisons really don't cut the mustard.
Well, I have a whole section in my book on King Arthur, and I point out how many of the reasons given for believing in the Jesus story fall apart when you look at the King Arthur story. For example, many people say, well, how can you have that level of detail in the Gospels unless it were true? You have a lot of persons' names and places. Well, you look at King Arthur, and there's even more detail. And the biographies seem very full. There's some places we can see are real places, but all stories always combine an element of fiction with a little bit of truth. The other thing is you can construct very elaborate stories very quickly out of virtually nothing, and that's the case with King Arthur. There were just little bits and pieces before around 1130 when the main biography was written. You can go from almost zero to nothing. You also find examples today of how it is that traditions can get started with no historical basis whatsoever. For example, Elvis Presley is supposed to be alive, according to many people. Some 30 million Americans, according to one Time survey, believe Elvis is alive, despite the fact that there's testimony that he was buried, and that he's still in the tomb. Yet most people don't think it's Elvis in that tomb, even when it's occupied. So empty tombs, actually, occupied tombs don't prevent stories of empty tombs, even today. And that's the problem. A lot of these stories, like King Arthur and so forth, have many of the same features, or have even more credibility in some cases than what we find for Jesus. As soon as you start comparing other mythical figures to Jesus, it gets harder and harder to tell them apart.
Another thing, Dr. Avalos, is that Bible scholars point to the essential importance of the Bible because of its aesthetical beauty. What is the fallacy in this thinking process?
Well, the fallacy is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so that it's difficult to say the Bible is the most beautiful book when really a lot of its poetry has been shown to be formulaic and based on earlier ways of doing poetry. So there have been the other works that use the same techniques used in the Bible, and no one is complaining that those works are not being enjoyed. The other thing is the text of the Bible itself. Most people don't realize that sometimes we don't know what words mean. And if you were to translate the book of Job, for example, and do it as honestly as possible, you might end up with sentences that say something like, and then Job did blank, and his friend said blank. Once you see that you'd have a book full of blanks, it would not be as aesthetically pleasing as what you have now. What translators have done is to insert words, guess words, just so that they don't have those blanks in the text, because people don't buy Bibles with blanks, And so in a way, modern publishers are like airbrushing the Bible and its problems, because in actuality, some parts of the Bible can be seen as very ugly from an aesthetic viewpoint. You know, they don't have the symmetry that a lot of people say is a feature of beauty. They're incomplete, which some people say completeness is a feature of beauty. So even by the standards used to sell the beauty of the Bible would fail.
Yes, I've heard that some of the early copies of the Book of Revelation show a very bad writing that has been, like you said, beautified throughout time.
Right. So, yeah, and that is the case, especially with biblical poetry.
And Dr. Avalos, hasn't the mass media and the internet stolen the thunder of traditional biblical studies? I guess the Da Vinci Code and Bart Ehrman's misquoting Jesus being perhaps the prime examples?
Yes, I believe that the main educator today on the Bible is the mass media. I must say, though, Bart Ehrman is a recognized biblical scholar, so he's one of the rare scholars who have been able to have a bestseller. It's not quite the case that no biblical scholar ever gets to sell, in large numbers. But yes, the mass media, particularly movies, now drive most of what people know or think they know about the Bible. And the Da Vinci Code would be an example, a very good example. But even so, I would still say that most movies are not anti-religious as much as they are espousing a different form of religion. So you don't find many movies that are out to expose religion as a bad thing, or what they do is expose certain forms of religion, but not religion itself. And so, to some extent, and I point examples out in my book, the movie industry is still quite religionist compared to, say, other forms of skepticism that they could place in their movies. Usually, supernatural events are validated, not invalidated in movies and TV. You look at, for example, the show called Supernatural today, or even The Simpsons, and the message is still quite traditional in many ways.
And just on a little side note, what is your favorite Jesus movie? What's the one movie you've really enjoyed?
The Life of Brian.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones too. Dr. Avalos, do you believe that the discoveries of both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library have diluted Bible studies as an important work of antiquity, or do you simply see them as three parallel studies that once in a while overlap?
I think they have diluted biblical studies, because if you look at the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the largest organization of biblical scholars in the world, and you listen to, read the article of one of the presidents, recent presidents, Robert Kraft, and he says, I'm not a biblical scholar because most of what I study is not really biblical. It's these para-biblical texts that I study, the texts that are not in the canon. So a lot of people that call themselves biblical scholars, or a lot of the sessions in the Society of Biblical Literature, are no longer about the Bible per se, but they study non-canonical texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gnostic Gospels, books that are not in the Bible. So it has diluted some. Now, there are, of course, as well, turf battles, in that some of the people, for example, studying Gnostic texts, don't always think they get the same sort of respect that the biblical scholars do in the Society of Biblical Literature. But apart from that, I would say that a lot of the people that would have gone into just straight biblical studies are now in the study of Nag Hammadi text and Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth. But still, the larger proportion is in the Bible. But if you compare it again to, say, 1900, you'd see the movement.
Yeah, and what I like about your book is that, one thing Christian apologists like to say is they say, whoa, the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we found is so similar to the Masoretic text.
Yes.
It's got to be true, but don't you point out that there's actually a lot of differences between the two?
Yeah, and that there are some texts that are like the Masoretic text, but they always forget that there are a lot of texts that are not. So, it's sort of like selective cherry picking. So yes, you could say, the book of Isaiah, found in Cave 1, is very similar to the Masoretic, but there are a whole lot of texts that are very, very different. And not to mention the many, many other texts that we found that we never knew were there that also seem to be authoritative at the time for the community, and they're no longer in the Bible. So, at least in the Western Bibles, for example, the book of Enoch is not in the Bible, even though some biblical writers thought the book of Enoch was perfectly good prophecy. The book of Jude, for example, and even though there were some early Christians like Tertullian who thought the book of Enoch belonged in the Bible. So the Dead Sea Scrolls only show us that the diversity of what the Bible meant. There's no such thing as the Bible, really, at that time. It's a later construct.
And if somebody were to come to you and say, I want to study the Bible, or at least read the Bible, what would you recommend as the best translation out there? Or should somebody have more than one Bible at their disposition?
Well, I would say the best thing you can do is learn the original languages. That's really the only way you'll ever be able to check for yourself whether a translation is correct or not. If you can't do that, or are not there yet, I would recommend either an interlinear or a parallel, a multiple version Bible. That way you can see the differences among the versions. You still won't be able to check which one's right, but at least you'll see that they differ.
And your book, Professor Avalos, ends with you saying, retain biblical studies, but redefine its purpose so that it is tasked with eliminating completely the influence of the Bible in the modern world.
Yes.
Why don't you want the Bible to influence the modern world?
Yes, and notice that it doesn't say end the Bible or get rid of the Bible. It's the influence of the Bible. Because I believe that any time you use a text, an ancient sacred text, to authorize modern behavior, you're only going to get chaos, because interpretation ultimately is a faith claim. And since all faith claims are equally unverifiable, there is no way to settle any arguments. And when there are no ways to settle arguments objectively, what tends to happen often is that you settle by violence. And I believe that a lot of the events in today's world are at least partially caused by certain interpretations of the Bible. And even though it is true that you can interpret the Bible peacefully as well as violently, that is sort of like Russian roulette. So that you, when you play Russian roulette and you don't get killed, that's just a gamble. Because the next time someone might interpret the Bible violently and get a lot of people killed. I say the best thing to do is get rid of the gun. Don't play Russian roulette at all. What I mean by the gun is it's not the Bible, but biblical authority. Once you say, we shouldn't settle our current situations by use of an ancient text. Let's use reason and empirical observation to see what we need. I mean, if dirty air is the problem, we don't need the Bible to tell us what to do. We know what to do. And, if there's poverty, we don't need the Bible to tell us to feed the hungry. We can do that on our own. To me, it's morally unjustified to have our actions authorized by a book than by our own sense of mercy and compassion. When I go and deliver food to a food shelter, I don't do it because an ancient text told me. I do it because I saw that there's a need and that people are hungry. The more we can get away from using text to authorize behavior, especially sacred ancient texts, not texts that are like the Constitution, that are at least open to a democratic process, then the better we're going to be. And that's why I don't want to end reading the Bible so much as I want to end the authority of the Bible in the modern world.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Dr. Avalos. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
You have yourself a good day now.
Bye-bye.
When I watch these TV evangelists on late night cable channel 666 and see the stadium full of people giving hard-earned money away to some chrome-head, sweat-covered, barking con man dangling eternal salvation in the front of these poor bastards like a leash in front of a chihuahua with one kidney, well, I am shocked at our lack of common sense. Clearly, this crook on TV couldn't be more full of shit if he were a porta potty at the Lollapalooza Festival.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Hector Avalos discussing the peril of biblical studies and the Bible itself against a postmodern age and its growing Medusa zeitgeist. Can it really survive? When you think of the resources and time invested in biblical studies, it's rather scary if it all came tumbling down. After all, who wants to see so many lose their livelihoods? I don't know. Some people are not ready to have their hearts broken yet, I say. But I'm sure biblical studies will continue for a while. And I will be the first to admit that, like so many ancient tones of antiquity, there is a liberating perfume that can lead to gnosis. The Bible has puissant stories of ethos and pathos that anyone can benefit from. The Bible is pregnant with Gnostic theology, hidden even beyond the words of St. Paul, as our Aeon Byte staff writer, Jim West, has proven over and over again in his articles you must investigate at theGodAboveGod.com. The Bible certainly has classic motifs, primordial archetypes, and didactic tales, most taken from past classics of other ancient civilizations. And perhaps most of all, Sophia is found there if you look hard enough. But there is that matter of perspective and being able to theologically chew bubblegum and walk at the same time. Again, Professor Hector Avalos is author of the book we just discussed, The End of Biblical Studies, Fighting Words, The Origins of Religious Violence, Can One Know God If God Exists, and Professor of Biblical and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Iowa. Highly recommend The End of Biblical Studies. If enough people read it, we might enjoy that double entendre he spoke of and allow other faiths to complete the broken circle that reflect the same broken circle of our lives. Plato said all learning is remembering, but he forgot there is so much to unlearn as well. So much waste material in the bowels of our soul that it might take lifetimes to clean. We are the eternal yet bizarro angel heart who, unlike Mickey Rourke, haven't gotten through too many plastic surgeries of denial and ignorance. And yes, we are still the Gnostics, until you hear that knock on the door or that new Sharia law over the airwaves. In a few of my words, we are gods in the becoming. But let me quote from the Nag Hammadi Library's excerpt of the Perfect Discourse, never meant to be considered a holy scripture like you find in the Bible, but a simple, timeless snapshot of free-thinking heretics and their musings. It turned out this way because of the will of God, that people should be better than the gods, since the gods are immortal, but only people are both immortal and mortal. People are related to the gods, and they know about each other with certainty. The gods know the concerns of people, and people know the concerns of the gods, as Slepus. I am talking about people who have attained learning and knowledge, or gnosis. About people who lack these things, we should not say anything bad, since we are divine and are going into sacred subjects. Since we have begun the discussion of the communion between gods and people as Slepus, understand what people can do. For just as the Father, the Lord of the universe, creates gods, so too people, mortal, earthly, living things who are not like God, create gods. People give and receive power. People become divine and create gods. Are you surprised, Asclepius? Are you too an unbeliever like so many? I am Abraxas, broadcasting at the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.cam. The road is ended, the song is over. Thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved true seekers.